today for our current series that we are doing on contemporary issues, and in our endeavor to bring policy-oriented research and also to have research-based policy advice, we go around the world looking for the best minds to come and speak to us. It is in that context today we have invited Rinru Shi, and Zinrui had given a talk at Columbia, and I was really impressed by the depth of knowledge that she had. She comes from China. More details the chairman will give, but that is how we got her to come and speak today. It is in the context of housing, land development that today's lecture series should be seen. With this, I hand it over to the chairman to conduct the proceedings for today. Thank you.
I think we, I hope I am able to pronounce the name properly, but we are fortunate at EGROW to have Ms. Jin Rui Shi from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and she's going to talk to us about land value capture. I guess, China is one of the countries which have been very successful, and presumably you will be talking about that experience in how that was managed. And of course, there may be questions on how much it is applicable to, a country like India, a democracy where it's a little more difficult to capture these things. But yes, so with that, let me, I'll invite you to start. As Dr. Charan Singh said, we'd like you to speak for about 40 minutes, and then hopefully there'll be questions for 20 minutes. So please start.
Thank you, Charan, and thank you, Dr. Vermani, for the kind introduction and for introducing me to the EGROW Foundation. It's my great pleasure to meet with you all, and I'm very excited to share with you my learning and insights on land value capture, which I think is a great strategy to finance our urban infrastructure goods and to achieve various social, economic, and environmental objectives. So just a quick clarification. So today I will try to cover many examples worldwide, so it's not just limited to China. And no problem. And and then you will see that I think this is an even more promising thing, that this could be even more relevant to India, because many democratic societies also have a successful experience in implementing land value capture, as you will see in my presentation. So without delay, we'll start. So first, a little bit of a history. So land value capture is a policy approach that through careful planning and regulation, cities and communities can recover land value increases from public investment and reinvest that value to fund infrastructure, services, and other public goods. So the core premise of land value capture is public investment should generate public benefit. This idea can be traced to Henry George, who's an American economist and social activist very influential in the 19th century, the middle and late 19th century. In his important treatise, Progress and Poverty, which was published in 1879, he succinctly pointed out that social economic progress does not eliminate poverty and can even exacerbate inequality. The cause of inequality he thinks the cause of inequality is private land ownership, because landlords enjoy enormous profit not only from his hard work or his own investment, but also from windfalls of economic growth or public investment that happen in his location, such as railway station or rail line built adjacent to his property and can increase value, especially for commercial properties. So Henry George saw that as a great injustice. And in his time, he advocated for implementing a land value tax to tax that increment of windfall, to capture the windfall. But during his time, the single tax was not implemented because of political challenge and also for practical operational reasons. Like it's very hard to estimate or appraise land value, and still to this day, it's a daunting challenge to do mass appraisals. But his insights on land economic development influence many generations, and including the founder of the Lincoln Institute. And that's why I want to start with this old guy in late 19th century. And I think more interestingly, Henry George's inquiry can still be very relevant and profound today. I think a few years ago, a bestseller book by Piketty, The Capital, also basically points out the same issue, that those with assets enjoys a great amount of wealth and benefited disproportionately compared to those without assets. And so I think this again kind of begs the question, or asks the question, that growth and development, especially in the city, urbanization, create on one hand increased income and better quality of life, but equity and public interest should also always be at the center for the policy makers, including economists or urban planners or city leaders. And land value capture, again, can play a very important role to accomplish that. So I think land value capture is a way to help us think what a sustainable, equitable model of urban development should look like. So yeah, in short, why land value capture? Because first, urbanization generates great windfalls, and it's being proven empirically worldwide, and it's of course obvious to many urban economists that access to infrastructure and distance to urban center really has a positive impact on the increment in land prices. And the approach of land value capture can enable communities to recover and reinvest that value increase resulting from public investment and other government actions. So there are many different types of land value capture mechanisms that's being implemented around the world. And this is a quick list of the toolbox under this concept. And I will walk you through very quickly. We have 40 minutes, but I'll try to explain each one of those and with some examples. So I think land value capture can really help cities accomplish social, economic, and environmental objectives, including finance large infrastructure projects, facilitate economic development and urban regeneration, provide affordable housing, strengthen municipal fiscal capacity, and build climate resilience. So I try to group the different land value capture mechanisms under these 5 objectives, and because those are, and then you will see the context and how the different value capture tools can be used and to accomplish those goals. But of course, just like all these goals or objectives are not in silos, they're interconnected. The land value capture tools can also be applied in a number of different settings and to achieve multiple goals. But just for the sake of explanation and clarity, I group the value capture mechanisms under each of these objectives. Basically, are the settings when they're most commonly applied. So the first is financing large infrastructure projects. So these includes real plus property, land readjustment, CPACs or charges for building rights and land leasing. So the development, so financing infrastructure, large infrastructure projects is a challenge faced by many cities around the world. The reasons being it can be very costly and it's a very complex project that requires very sophisticated financing instruments as well as governance structure. And also, I think the biggest, even though development of, but on the other hand, large infrastructure projects, when it's developed, can generate huge benefits to the cities and really increase the competitiveness of the city. And also development of mass transit, large infrastructure projects, especially the transit system, can play a very positive role in the increase of property, surrounding property values. But so far, it is also observed that just relying on user fees like tickets alone and is not enough to maintain, to finance or maintain these infrastructure. And also betterment derived from public infrastructure investment often are not effectively captured by many local governments. So land value capture may provide a different approach, or can be, I think it's a very useful strategy to consider in the beginning stage of financing, of planning for infrastructure projects. So first, real plus property co-development model. So this is also pretty common and often commonly called or related to the transit-oriented development. So basically for new rail lines, the government provides transit authority with land development rights at stations along the route at the price that is before transit development value, which is pretty low, so unserviced land. And then the authority then partner with private developers to develop real estate near the route and shares the profit and use that profit to then reinvest in transit system or have fundings for maintenance. So the transit TOD or the R+P model has been widely successful and first implemented in Hong Kong and Japan, and now it's being widely used on a scale in China. And most of the Chinese high-speed rail system stations and the city's MTR systems are developed under this model. So there are two approaches for, in China, there are two approaches of TOD or Real Plus development. One is transit company led, and then the other is public led or the government led approach. So the transit development, transit company led approach basically is that land is allocated along the metro line to urban metro companies. And then when metro companies take charge of the property development, and then it will receive benefit revenues from company sales. So this is a little bit versus the government-led approach is basically local governments acquire and reserve the land before the building of public transit, and the local government sell the land to developers by tendering, listing, or auction. And then land transfer revenue will actually be the value increment that's captured by the local government. So the picture that you see on the right is the Shenzhen Subway Financial Center in China. So this is the plaza that's made. This is kind of a view taken from this skywalk, and then you can see the plaza that was opened. I think this was opened in 2018. So Shenzhen MTR is considered a very successful example. So it used the transit company-led approach. So basically, the Hong Kong Mass Transit Railway (MTR) Corporation partnered with the Shenzhen government, and they established a Shenzhen MTR Corporation that is in charge of financing, operationalizing, developing the project. So by 2016, Shenzhen Metro System, using this approach, has built 7 metro lines in operation, and with a length of 257 kilometers, and it acquired 3 million square meters of property projects, and the property sale reached 42 billion Chinese yuan only a year and a half later after the project completed. And the housing prices, the real estate price in Shenzhen continue to rise. So basically, this is seen as a very successful model. And it also, of course, relieved the pressure of car ownership and congestions in urban areas that will give the city more capacity to grow, facing increasing population. So the next land value capture instrument I want to introduce to financing large infrastructure projects is charges for building rights and CPACs. And this is a picture of a favela in Sao Paulo, Brazil. It's the Jardim Edit area. So previously, 30 years ago, this has been a favela on the swampy side of Sao Paulo. And but in 2002, the city's master plan classified this one as a special zone of social interest, because later on it's just like many other slums or favelas, it's just being surrounded by the growth of the cities. And in 2002, the city designated as a special area to think about ways to redevelop it without causing too much social disruptions or displacement of the local residents. So after the redevelopment, this is what it looks like in 2018, in 2008, I'm sorry. Okay, I'll continue.
Continue, please.
Yes. So this is a picture after the whole area is being redeveloped and cleaned up with new installment of new pavements, city light service and sewage systems. And this is the apartment building that's built and housed 220 and 250 families that used to be the previous residents of this slum area. So how did it happen? So this whole project is really financed under using these charges for the building rights approach. So the basic idea is the Sao Paulo Planning Authority regulates the density of development through setting a base floor area ratio, or FAR, and a maximum FAR. So a base FAR is the density at which a developer can build without paying fees, and a maximum FAR is where most dense development permitted, and most where you can build the most density in the city. So developers can, can you hear me? I hope you can. All right. So developers can purchase building rights up to the maximum FAR allowed. And this is especially in commercial corridors near transit station or other areas designated by the policymaker. And in this case, is the Sao Paulo government is being proactive, and they designated, they identified the areas the most likely to see growth, and they really be able to, and this makes the building rights, and they be able to impose the FAR and allow the developers to bid for it. And then the process of bidding, which is also pretty unique, it's also called CPACs. CPACs is basically the Portuguese shorthand for Certificate of Potential Construction Actions. So this is basically building rights, this density, extra densities that developers can bid for. And CPACs are sold by electronic auction in the Sao Paulo Stock Exchange market since 1995. So it has a long experience and successful track record. And it's also been regulated. It's regulated by the Sao Paulo Stock Exchange as well, the commission. So the good thing about the auction model is that compared to, transfer development rights or try to put a price on the development rights by the government, the price is determined by the market and it's very dynamic, and it doesn't require heavy, soft infrastructure investment like the finding the appraisal system or property assessment, which was a challenge seeing the Chinese model of using the normal R plus real. So the charges of development rights and CPACs has been a very important source of revenue and has provided funding for improving its transit system and building new bus transit or new bridges and parks and other systems, other services. So next slide. Yeah, I apologize. I have to kind of just give a very quick overview of every cases because I do want to just give a comprehensive introduction of the varieties of land value capture instruments. So please, if it's a little bit confusing, and I'm happy to address any questions at the Q&A sessions and provide further readings if you're interested. So land readjustment. Land readjustment, the idea is kind of similar, but it's seen as more bottom up and more local and more voluntary, because it's mostly land owners themselves collectively cooperate with a municipality or with a developer to pool their land to accomplish a redevelopment project. So this can occur in both urban and rural areas. So the pretty interesting example, the Greater Tokyo area in Japan. So this is one of the most successful examples of large-scale redevelopment. It's also a combination of land readjustments and the R plus P. So the Greater Tokyo Railway Network use the land readjustment as a mechanism to pool land of nearby households and then consolidate land for a larger scale development. And the examples of land readjustments in Europe, including, for example, Rotterdam in Netherlands and some cities in Germany, is more like is more oftenly used land readjustments to pool rural land, and then it's a rural landowners will work with a developer or municipality to relocate to transfer their land to developers, and then after the development is completed, they'll be able to maybe receive a smaller parcel of land that has greater value because new infrastructure is installed, or the location becomes more adjacent to the urban center. So moving on to the second objective that land value capture can help cities achieve, which is it can play a very important role to facilitate economic development and urban regeneration. And this picture is Shanghai Xingtiandi, which is one of the very good examples of successful redevelopment in China that be able to preserve historic neighborhoods and be able to revitalize the region and without destroying the culture. And yeah, so they're different. And under this categories, I'll be introducing Betterment contribution, special assessment district, business improvement district, and land banks. So Betterment contributions and special assessment, I'm going to group it together because the concept is similar. So basically, property owners the concept is that is a little bit similar to a user fee, but the users are property owners, and the fee is to pay for the service such as sewage or light or police firefighters. So whoever benefits and are the same ones who pays. So this could include sewage, water lines, road improvements, street lighting, and so any special benefits. And the betterment levies from property owners have really helped cities strengthen or improve its revenue base, and also provides extra funding for cities to fund infrastructure and including road improvements, and then help funding urban renewal. And one example of this is especially used widely in Latin American countries. It's pretty easy to implement. And one good example is this picture. This is the Alfonso Lopez Plaza in the city of Manizal, Colombia. So this in Colombia, the cities are even less resourceful than the cities in China, and they're facing constant constraint. And a Betterment contribution really helped the cities to redevelop this plaza and preserve some historic building as well. The business improvement district is a very common strategy used in US cities. So this is when a city would designate a geographic area the city will oversee and fund that area, fund that area's maintenance improvements, and also the city will promote, will also join effort with private developers and also business owners to promote the region, promote the commercial district. So a successful example of this is Hudson Yard. Maybe many of you have been in New York City. So it's very expensive to redevelop in New York City, and BID is really successful in this case. That it was established in 2013 and it's quite large. It's actually covers several major streets or blocks. And nowadays, the BID really helped this area to not only create a new landmark and attracts a lot of businesses, created a lot of office and luxury housing, but also was able to designate certain certain areas for affordable housing, which I would explain later. So the property owner pays fees to support the operation of the BID, and this will also make the business related service. So this makes sure that the further business service can be paid by the property owners, and the cities will have a sustainable revenue source to continue improve and develop this area, and or use that fund to develop other area. Land banks. So land bank is interesting because New York City is a very prosperous and rich city, whereas land banks, it can be a very powerful tool for cities that are in financial distress. So land banks are governmental entities or nonprofit corporations that are mostly focused on the conversion of vacant, abandoned, and tax delinquent properties back to the productive use. So in a context, so after the 2008 global financial crisis or recession. U.S. cities like Detroit and Cleveland, Baltimore, the so-called Rust Belt cities, faced a huge crisis of large numbers of vacant, abandoned, and tax delinquent properties, and resulting in ghost towns that many of you may have heard of. And so land bank was established and really become really implemented on a large scale to help solve the problem. So usually, depending on the structure or the legal mandate of the land bank, usually land banks can obtain properties at low or almost no cost through the tax foreclosure process or judicial foreclosure process. And then they'll be able to hold the land tax-free, and then they can clear the titles or extinguish. In some cases, they will even demolish the properties, demolish certain properties. And so in a sense, reducing the supply on the market. And then they also facilitate sales based on not only just highest bid, but also the, try to further some social objectives or the city's development objectives that are most closely aligned to the community's needs, such as, providing workforce housing or grocery or sites for public services that are needed in the locality. So in Detroit and in Cleveland, and recently I learned even from Akron, Ohio, which is a smaller post-industrial city, land banks can hold local housing stock as large as high as 30% of the total housing stocks in the city. So they really have, and then if it's used well, if land banks really cooperate or coordinate with the city's finance or finance, economic development, and planning agencies, they can really make a huge difference in determining or deciding the city's development trajectory, which is probably sounds like pretty unusual because this is in the U.S. and is usually a very decentralized local government system. So, but land bank has become very powerful, and there are a lot of case studies on how it helped revitalize the downtown areas, for example, and then bring back property values in cities that struggling in the financial crisis. So next objective is providing affordable housing. So there are many policy tools, and even the ones that I mentioned above can really have a positive impact or directly generate affordable housing in the cities. So, but in this section, I will be mostly introducing inclusionary or incentive zoning in the U.S., as well as community land trust and share equity housing. I will not talk too much about developers' obligations. That's very common in China, but in a sense, it's also similar to the impact fees. Basically, it's like in China, as you know, urban land is owned by the government. So when they lease land to private developers to build apartments or other housing, they usually impose some conditions that the developers has to agree to build kindergarten or hospital, depending on the needs of the locality. But it's pretty general concept, so I will not spend too much time here. And the developer obligations also sometimes include building on-site or off-site, providing on-site or off-site affordable housing. So back to the US, so inclusionary or incentive zoning is now very commonly implemented in especially bigger metropolitan areas like New York, Boston, San Francisco, all these cities that face huge pressure of the shortage of affordable housing. So in its simplest form, an inclusionary zoning program requires developers to offer a certain percentage of new residential units to low-income households. And most inclusionary housing programs mandates the provision of on-site affordable units in market rate development. Developers can receive incentives such as increased density from the city to offset costs. So this is also a similar concept to the charges of development rights in Sao Paulo. So most programs in the US cities require between 10% to 20% of units dedicated for affordable housing or mixed income housing. Cities, but developers sometimes can also just either build affordable housing offsites or from the main project, or they can sometimes pay a fee or make a contribution to the city's affordable housing fund as an alternative. So the picture shows the Palmer Dock and Edge community apartments in Brooklyn. So this is an example of the affordable housing components of a larger Northside Piers and Edge development program. This is along the Brooklyn waterfront. So both projects received, by building these projects, they really, the developers were able to receive density bonus and tax abatement from the city. And another example is Denver, which is kind of almost hard to believe that is even in the center or western part of the U.S. Where there's more sprawling, but there's the cities also struggle with affordable, where land is vast and plenty, but cities still struggles with providing affordable housing because of the tremendous growth and the influx of population, as well as, you know, there are certain culture or certain benefits from the cities that cannot be replaced by the suburbs. So in 2017, so Denver also faces a lot of demand of affordable housing. So in 2017, Denver started to use the incentive overlay, which is a similar idea to you know, all these density bonus type of value capture tools to transform a former industrial hub in a River North into a mixed-use neighborhood. So this neighborhood is anchored by a new commuter rail, and the city is really trying to require affordable housing to be built on site so that the work and not to build it offsite, which will be too far away for transit and will create a whole lot of problems. So this is also another example of mandatory inclusionary housing or incentive zoning. So speaking of affordable housing, I think it's also important to mention community land trust, which is probably not as common in the public idea and then awareness, but community land trusts are a very useful strategy to provide permanent affordable housing. And this is especially interesting because this is widely used in the US, because US is, as we all know, is a private land ownership. It has a culture of private home ownership, but community land trust kind of changed that idea. Is based on its land ownership structure is basically land rests in the community or in the trust, and homeowner only owns the improvements on top of the land. So in this case, the idea is that in this case, land increment stays in the community, and then homeowners can still receive some equity, and first they can enjoy relatively low cost housing, and also they can receive some investment returns if they decide to exit the land trust. It's just the return will be capped. So this is a way to ensure permanent affordable housing. And this usually is done by community development activists, sometimes with aid and promotion of the local governments, and this and now there are about like 300 or more community land trusts. It's not too big, but I think it's a growing trend, especially in very expensive cities that using the tax credits itself cannot preserve affordable housing when the time credits when the tax credit expires. So this is one example of CLT in East Village in New York. And CLT can also be, or share equity housing can also be an innovative way to redevelop slums and informal housing. And this is a picture of the Cattle Mountain Pina Community Land Trust in San Juan, Puerto Rico. So Community Land Trust was able to, the local governments and residents use community land trust to preserve and develop a 100-year, almost like a 1 century old settlement, informal settlement near the river canal. And then by using the CLT, they were not formally, so these are informal housing mostly. So the people living there don't really have titles to the property. And using the CLT really helps the government to, without changing the ownership structure, provide real benefit for the local residents. So this area is now redeveloped. So I see the time is running very fast, so I'll be quickly just speaking about the strengths in the municipal fiscal health. As we already mentioned, many cities, whether rich and poor, are equally facing revenue and fiscal constraints. And exactions and impact fees are ways for cities to capture values when there is usually a negative impact of development. So for example, a big commercial development can exert extra pressure on the transit system, or will demand additional public service. So exactions and impact fees can help cities to recover that cost. So San Francisco, for example, the development impact fees has yielded more than $500 million US within 3 years. And impact fee is also, or linkage fee, it's also called linkage fee, in Boston have helped, basically is implemented or is required. Developers have to pay that if the real estate development, the floor area is larger than 10,000 square foot. And previously, the developers of large commercial real estate projects right now they are paying almost $11 per square foot to the city to fund affordable housing and workforce development. And this year, Boston mayor suggests calls for 40% hike and now wants to boost that amount to $15.39 per square foot. And of course, there are a lot of oppositions, but also support. So we don't know whether to be able to successfully hike the price, but exactions and impact fees is a very common scheme or useful strategy for city to get the extra revenue to fund its local, to fund public service. So lastly, land value capture can also be a strategy to help building climate resilience. So this actually is more exploratory. There are some successful examples of land readjustment, both in Netherlands, which land readjustment helps local governments to reclaim wetlands and farmlands. And also land banks can play a role in climate resilience because a lot of the distressed neighborhoods also face flood risk and other extreme weathers, and they're even more vulnerable. So maybe if planned properly and with coordinated actions, land bank can also help playing a role. And I would like to mention the sponge city, which is illustrated in this picture. This is in Shenzhen. So sponge cities are by definition areas designed to use a combination of storage tunnels, permeable pavements, rain gardens, constructed ponds and wetlands to store as much water as possible to help city defend risk of flooding and inundation and storm surge. So it is a very important engineering or green infrastructure, but it's also very, very expensive because you have to also think about how to retrofit the current cities to the infrastructure in the current city development. So I think China has been very Chinese cities in the past 5 years that have experienced also extreme weather situation and flooding in cities. So sponge city as a concept is very gaining a lot of public support, and then the Chinese government used Shenzhen as a pilot city for the sponge city initiative. But the bigger problem of implementing sponge city on scale is financing. So there are a lot of exploratory research and like pilot projects or just proof of concept type of projects to think about how land value capture can play a role in building climate resilience. And lastly, transfer of development rights. So this is basically landowner pays government entity a fee to transfer the density potential of one tract of land to a non-contiguous parcel of land that's better suited for greater densities. So this is usually used to curb sprawl and to allow cities to concentrate developments and mixed use in designated areas with, for example, existing infrastructure rather than keep sprawling and providing new infrastructure. It's widely used in the state of Pennsylvania and Massachusetts for farmland preservation and preservation of land resources. And it's used in the New York cities to preserve historic landmarks and also cultural districts and parks and recreation. And interestingly, I learned recently that India has implemented TDR. So in Mumbai since 1991 and in Hyderabad in 2019. So I'm curious if any one of you knows more about this, and I'm curious to learn the Indian experience of TDR. So of course, there are some prerequisites and challenges for successful implementation of land value capture, including enabling framework. You have to figure out who owns the land. So it needs to have some institutions like land cadastre system, registration, the protection of property rights in place. And there can also be political challenges, especially when in a regimes like common law regimes where land is under private ownership and any kind of land government regulation or intervention could become taking or regulatory taking. And also there are governance and operation challenges. So it's a very sophisticated project that really, in order to run it well, it's not easy and requires a lot of careful research and public engagement. And here are some thoughts on how to succeed, like clear objectives, what are we trying to accomplish. Maybe it's also very important to have an integrated policy approach and to coordinate with different departments of the government. And it's important to analyze local laws because there's no policy tools that fits all. And on the other hand, there's a lot of flexibilities and to use a combination of approaches. And it's important to evaluate the legal feasibility, which largely determines how much government can do or to capture the value. Flexibility and localization and the same idea, and also communication and public engagement. So this is very important because I think the general public, even though eventually, social, economic, and environmental objectives are in the public's long-term interest, but how to communicate that when you try to have a tax hike or impose additional fees on developers or homeowners, it's sometimes very challenging. It's a daunting task. So that also requires long-term preparations and proactive engagement early on in the process. So I can also talk a little bit about the Lincoln Institute's. So basically our work in the land value capture, we have supported a lot of research and education, as well as providing technical assistance for governments. So especially the cases I cited, we did a lot of, in our China Center, supported a lot of research on transit-oriented development. And our Latin American program has long been a partner, thought partner, and provide technical assistance to cities like Sao Paulo and also Colombia. And then very recently in 2018, we launched a global campaign on land value capture, and we partnered with the OECD to create a global compendium that will introduce and compare international practices around and also establish international standard and guiding principles for successful implementation and design of the implementation and design of a project or a policy. And most recently, allow me to advertise our Indian land database. We partnered with Development Data Lab. So it's a group of US researchers that conducted research in India. They linked various social economic databases in India, and then especially they created a land database, including land use disputes, litigation, and also the normal planning, development, density. And the interesting thing is that they even created a database for TDR, transfer development rights, that include market TDR prices for Hyderabad in 2020, and they also have now a comprehensive database for 20 years of market transfer development rights price of Mumbai. So, but of course, we now have access to that database, but we really don't know much about India and do not have a lot of experience. So very interested to learn from your reactions and questions, and also for the opportunities that maybe you can really help us understand what is successful, what is successful about the TER, or the challenges that you may face in India.
Thank you.
Sorry that I'm going overhead, but I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that was very interesting. Before I open it to questions, I just want to kind of point out, make 2 points which I think are relevant for India at this stage, and you can answer either now or later. One of the issues which is very important and difficult in India is the acquisition of land, whether it's urban land particularly, but even land for large, like highways through rural areas, etc. So, of course, the land is owned in rural areas by farmers, in urban areas by private individuals, and the whole process of acquiring acquisition, the whole issue of pricing and all is very, very contentious. So any comments or experiences with respect to easing that? We used to have a procedure where the government could compulsorily announce a price, acquire whatever land was needed, whether it was for an industrial estate or for anything else. But it was increasingly questioned in the courts and elsewhere, and there was a new law. But the whole thing is still, this issue is a very difficult and contentious one in India. And the second issue, which is slightly new and for the future, given that we are all talking about green economy and climate change, I and a colleague of mine have a paper on something called natural cities, where we proposed a design for new cities of up to 2 million on waterways. And I'm just mentioning this in case you have some experience. You mentioned at the end this issue of storage of water or overflows, etc., etc. What we had done was given a design for what we call natural cities. Anyway, with that, let me, as I said, you can address it as you go along, but let me first give the chance to Dr. Mansi. Vinayak has been waiting with a question, so we'll take the question from her in person. Can you just shut off the presentation so we can see more people?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So Dr. Vinayak, if you want to come on, unmute and ask your question, and then Madam, you can answer whatever together the questions. Yeah.
Good evening, sir. Hello, ma'am. Sir, actually, I just completed my PhD thesis and it was very closely related to today's topic. I worked on rural housing, and over there I realized that land is, of course, a contentious issue, because here in India we have different types of ownerships and lal dora and everything. So I just posed a question over here wherein I asked that for a developing country like India, is it feasible that a rural housing model has a concept of contribution of the beneficiary itself? And if it is possible, if it is feasible, then how can it be done? If ma'am could give some views of hers.
Yeah, so you can take all the stuff which I have said and what she has said and answer whatever you think relevant.
I can first answer the first two questions posed by Dr. Ramani. And then the last question, I think I might even ask you a clarifying question. Are you saying about the rural housing, like mortgages? Or I think I kind of, maybe the audio is, my audio was a little bit off. So if you don't mind, can you?
I can hear it.
Yeah. Can you clarify the question again or type it in the chat box and then I can address that?
I think she's saying.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Let me just read it out. She said, is a model of rural housing feasible where the beneficiary also contributes? I presume one way would be some kind of land pooling, right? Where somebody contributes the land and then, yeah.
Yeah. So then I'll address that question first then. So that model is exactly, it's a land, it sounds like very similar to the land readjustment model if you're talking about in Europe, but that model actually requires kind of a lot of consensus in the rural areas. So you need to have either a very strong and very capable local government or a nonprofit or a developer with social economic like those ESG objectives to really work with the local landowners, property owners to pool the resources and agree on a plan. So it's actually, it's easier said than done. I think that's why it happens more naturally, or it's more common in countries with very strong capacities or rich experience in mobilizing the local or communication and have good communication strategies with the local communities. And then the other way, I was thinking, of course, China is not I guess in a sense, not a great example here, because we hear a lot of the best stories about taking rural land without fair compensation to the villagers. But on the other hand, there are also some benefits or goodness about that, is that when you have a strong village leader or a strong local government, kind of a strong local government or leadership, that you can also be able to figure out a plan and develop your village. So yeah, so but in China it's more, that kind of a development is often resulting, it's not recognized by the formal housing market due to our own political constraints, but you know, in fact, in reality, some villages were developed really just by the village leader. They create corporations, and then they pull the resources from the members of the village, and they be able to transform or build their own infrastructure and really transform their village. So one example is Zhengkezhuang in Beijing, and in Beijing suburb, and that now has also become a good example that governments actually permit and even encourage to some extent, that that is the village who basically use its own land to initially develop illegally. They built housing and amenities on land that was previously designated for agricultural use or not for commercial development, and they're not subject to zoning. But then they still be able, but then on the other hand, they kind of just did it anyways, and then later on they will retrofit and legalized as Beijing grows and as the government realized that that's just the reality. You can't really drive all the villages away, and it's given that they already have a very well developed area with their own infrastructure, why not let them have it? So yeah, so that's another thing. That's, there are a lot of uncertainties, a lot of inflexibilities and institutional barriers, but villages can still find ways, different models to redevelop. And I think the lessons from China there is that the government, the central government, or the lawmakers or policy makers should stay tuned with what is happening on the ground, and not just kind of brush it away as being, this is illegal and we don't want it, we want to demolish it, but be actually more flexible and think about creative ways to integrate that into the formal system. So the questions, regarding the questions of land acquisition challenge in India, so Dr. Ramani, that sounds similar to, I would say, the early, you know, what happened to China, because even China is kind of strange. It has a dual, it will have a dual system, as many of you may know. So land, urban land is owned by the state, the government, which is effectively managed by city municipalities, while as rural lands are held under the village collectives. So for the government, for urban development purpose, so first there is a process of city governments acquire land from rural village collectives, and city governments has the monopolistic power for urban development. So village collectives cannot develop land on their own, even if they happen to be adjacent to the urban boundary. So there were initially, there were a lot of land acquisition going on 20 years ago, or in the past 20, 30 years. But as land prices rise very quickly, and also as more farmers realize that they've been paid poorly or they gave up their land too early, so now land acquisition has become a huge challenge. It's very hard for the government to actually use taking eminent domain because they're worried about the social instability issues that farmers will protest, or people who lose land could stir some other political problems. So they stopped. So land acquisition is a challenge in China as well. And needless to say, in the US or in common law countries where private property is is almost secret, and then some people really believe that it's a constitutional right, and it's very hard to do taking an eminent domain. So I think that's why land value capture, like in some ways, they actually, a lot of it doesn't require direct taking or acquisition of land. It's more like using regulations to create incentives and also, I guess, disincentives to influence the property owners or developers' behavior. And I also think like a lot of this value capture and land financing practice it's an emerging process. So it's hard to predict because it's changing all the time, and it can adapt as city face as the city grows. So yeah, so it's just how to identify the stages where we are and what we need is very important.
Right. Thank you. So we have two more questions already. First, Dr. Nayak, and then Dr. Sanyal, you can ask your questions. Dr. Nayak first. Dr. Nayak, are you there? Ramesh Chandra Nayak? Nayak, sorry. Nayak, yes. Or if you're not there, then Dr. Ayanendu Sanyal. Dr. Sanyal?
I was just thinking that given the present
go ahead.
Given the present pandemic situation, what do you think is the demand supply situation in housing in India, China, and the US?
I can't probably I'll try my best to give my thoughts on the supply demand in China, I guess, and US. It will be very impressionistic. So China, it really depends on the cities, the areas, which area you're talking about. So in we call it tier 1 cities, like the mega city areas, the huge metropolitans with populations over 10 million people, like Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou. So usually the demand is still very, very high, and supply of new construction is never enough. But then on the other hand, there's this issue of actually most of the city residents, people who have a city ID card, many of them already have more than one unit of a housing. So the problem is really the new city immigrants have strong demand for getting new housing in those cities, in those popular, attractive cities, but the cost is too high, and then it's almost it's very unaffordable. I think this is pretty similar to some stellar super cities in the US as well, like San Francisco, New York, Boston. Even during the pandemic, the housing prices still continue to rise, and it's getting more expensive almost every year. And the other problem with these global cities is just there's not only facing the domestic demands, but also are attractive destinations for depositing money or excess capital all over the world. So there are people in China, there's actually restrictions for foreigners to buy in Chinese cities, but still there are many other ways to circumvent that. And in US or in London, I guess even in some global cities in India, it's almost unstoppable for speculators to drive up demand or prices. But on the other hand, I mean, this just issue is really varied, and there are also oversupply of housing in many cities in China, especially we call it the 3rd tier, 4th tier cities, located in more inland part of China or have a smaller population. Some areas even facing population outmigration, so they lost population over time. So there are still the issues of oversupply in China. And also, I can speak a little bit more about China because recently I read another data that real estate sector already is 40% of the total income tax contribution. So that is really alarming. That it shows really in China we're having an overpriced market, and economy is overly dependent on real estate. So who knows? So far the bubble, if it's a bubble, hasn't burst yet. And then the government is thinking about the soft landing, but it's a very complicated issue that is another separate conversation, but no one can predict demand and supply, and it's very dynamic, and that's what I know for now. Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Nayak is back. Please ask your question, and then Mr. Vaishnavi.
So I also, yeah, sorry. I also saw a question in the chat. I think that's related to Dr. Vimani, your question on, any successful examples of implementing climate resilient or green infrastructure. So I think right now that's still the testing ground. It's still like even in the US, it's not done enough, and people are still trying to explore, or governments are trying to explore ways to address all these extreme weather-related risks. And now, even in the U.S., it's right now very fragmented, and there is no concerted effort. And recently, as we know, Biden released a climate change or combating climate change policy paper or statement, and that was very enthusiastic news to many people. So now there are the U.S. agencies, including the HUD and FHFA, are seeking public input in thinking about how to build resilience in their housing policy, housing finance, and local communities has been thinking about how to do that in planning. So there are some initiatives like by some coastal communities in the U.S. After the Hurricane Katrina, New York and Connecticut and some New England governments who were underwater literally during the climate disasters, they implemented a buyout program. So basically pay the homeowners who lived near the coast and pay them a price, or buy them out and make so that they can relocate to other places. So there's a buyout program, but it's not very high profile in a sense, and then it's pretty hard to implement. So, and also they didn't receive enough funding, and also in the U.S. the structure of insurance, like home insurance against flood risks, also needs dire reform. So right now there's this distorted incentives that the government still subsidize you if you your insurance, your flood insurance, even if you're living in a flood risk zone. So all of these must change, and all these things cannot be changed unless there's a really integrated effort and communication amongst different agencies. So yeah, so that's one lesson or one project, or one thing I know, because I worked with some experts in the coastal community retreat. They call it like climate retreat or mitigation projects. But yeah, so far this is completely exploratory. Even in developed world, people, businesses are, it's still too optimistic, or still lack enough, still not have enough data or awareness and in building resilience in our cities, even though that's very important to our future.
Okay, thank you. As I said before, Dr. Ramesh Chandra and Vaishnavi are the next two. If you want to ask, you have to ask personally, and then Mr. Tuteja. So 3 questions. We can take them all together. Dr. Nayak, please speak and ask your question. You are muted. You have to unmute yourself and ask the question. You're unmuted. Sorry. I don't know why you're not asking. You're writing, but you have to ask your question. I don't know if Miss, you can read the question is put down. He's written it many times if on the chat. Mr. Nayak has, and then Vishnavi. Mr. Vishnavi, do you want to speak out your question?
Sure, sir. Sir, I mean, ma'am.
Okay, sorry, I can't see you. You are a lady. Yeah, please.
Okay, so my question is, as the population is growing and some data suggests that during this time and in the coming 25 years, our population will grow rapidly. So how can we like preserve our biodiversity and not the fragment habitats? Because like managing land is also very important. So what is the most feasible way to do that?
Let's take another
Thank you.
patient. 1 second. Yeah, Mr. Tuteja.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. See, there are 2 questions which I have in mind. See, basically in India, as we see, there's a lot of conflict because the land use is being regulated by local state government as well as central government. So this is leading to a number of disputes at the time of execution of mega infrastructure projects. So how do we ensure a coherent land use policy to ensure development of major infrastructure projects, including mass transit systems? That is the first question. And second is when we develop more and more mass transit systems, people are getting basically pushed away and away from their workplaces, leading to long commutes and leading to a significant deterioration in their quality of life. So why not we promote a mixed use of land so that people don't have to commute long distances and workplaces as well as their homes or within a sort of non-power transport distance.
Please go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so first question on the population growth and the threat of the expansion of urban footprint to biodiversity. I think, yeah, that's definitely we've been experienced that all over the place, and it's very alarming to see the loss of natural habitat and the number of animals going extinct, and also plants. So I think one important idea is always this is basically the issue of urban sprawl that's being experienced in many other developed country as well as China. So one way is to kind of set an urban boundary or expansion boundary that you should encourage development within the areas that already have infrastructure, and not encroach on natural habitat or forest land or the other mountainous or the wetlands, etc. So you need to have an urban growth boundary, and you also need to have designated protection area or zones for conservation. But of course, it's hard to do. It's always a balancing act. So one idea is to actually really place the biodiversity or habitat land conservation as part of as one of the top priorities, that it needs to be made clear and loud in the planning, in plans, and also be considered in economic development as well, because they can generate really a long-term benefit. for the population. It's in the public's interest. I think the other thing is to really promote density within the city. So there's to encourage more density development in the urban areas. And the other thing is, I think, being widely used, which land value capture can play a role, which is transfer of development rights. So in China and the US, in China, there is a program. So first they have a designated red line for farmland protection. And I think they should also have a designated red line for forest land or the other natural habitat, so that if the city wants to develop, they can exchange. So it's like a ticket system that it's essentially is to transfer development rights that cities pays for some other villages or locality to make sure that they don't develop, they don't build on their land, but they can transfer their building quotas to the cities to accommodate development. So that's one way of doing it. So it's a similar idea to land readjustment, pulling undeveloped village land and then enter into some arrangements or programs with the city, and also transfer development rights. So to let the developers compensate villagers or landowners who decide to preserve land. And also private land conservation, like conservation easements or some tax incentives can also help, can also play a role. So to address the other two questions, I'm sorry that it's a little bit fast, so I might not hear your questions very clearly, but I did notice that you're saying why not mixed use, and mixed use, more mixed use developments can really help accomplish many different goals. So it's one stone, multiple birds. Why don't we do that? I think that's a great question. We should really do that. But then the problem with U.S. cities, for example, is NIMBYism. So homeowners, especially in the suburbs, they protest against mixed use. So they don't want to have more density built next to their house. They want to have their own piece. They have their own garden, even though it could be aggregation, it will really cause a much larger urban footprint and inefficiency in land use. I think mixed use is definitely a value, objective that's being really actively pursued by planners all over the place. And in China and in many cities also, like mixed use, even in China, like our planning laws was really outdated and really not makes it very hard to develop mixed use projects. So yeah, so I think that's definitely should be at the center of any good urban planning practice, and just, I guess the public should also be more informed about the benefits of density concentrated development and mixed usage. I think I missed the first question. Yeah.
Mr. Jaglan and Ms. Brahmshri. I think likely we'll just have those last two questions. Go ahead, Mr. Jaglan.
Sir, shall I start, sir?
Yes, please.
Okay, sir, I am Brahmshri. I just want to add 2 points to the discussion. Land mafia and then even land reforms, they are interconnected, both in urban India as well as in rural India. So when we are talking about the increase in land pressure per square, or even we can see that the real estate boom in urban areas had increased tremendously, and this has also indirectly contributed for illegal occupation and then the rise of land mafia. When we look at the agrarian sector, land reforms were not implemented seriously, and there is lots of pressure on land. Land poses a great challenge both in urban area as well as rural area, commercialization, and then holding of land also brought about a radical shift in the ideology of government. Because in the state of Telangana, we have one scheme which is known as the Right to Bandhu. The ownership rights are going to be transferred to the farmer. Okay, sir. With this, I will stop.
Thank you.
So
Mr.
I
Jagman.
heard a comment. Yeah. So just now I heard a comment on the real estate boom and the difficulties of really making any land reform in India. What was the question? Do you mind repeating that again?
Ma'am, my question is, as long as we can't resolve the land disputes or conflicts related to the ownership rights, inheritance rights, and we are not able to provide the necessary security for the landholders, it is going to end up in legal disputes and real progress is not happening. In other words, we are not able to handle the land properly. I had seen in the city of Hyderabad murders happening just because of land dispute, just because of real estate business. So the issue is crossing the limits. This is my submission.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Yeah. For the
Okay,
context and
go ahead. There's somebody.
I go ahead.
No, there's some other person is not speaking.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll wait.
Do you want to ask a question? There were two people waiting. I guess they are not. Mr. Jaglan and what was it? There was one more I had said. Go ahead. Jaglan? Amit Kumar Jaglan?
Oh, I saw
Okay.
his question on the chat, and he said that his mic is not working properly, but I can just answer the question
Please.
in the chat box. Yeah. So the two questions. One is, without the security of land ownership or protection of land ownership, how can any of these land reform be really implemented or become successful? I think that's a great question and a great comment, because it is the security of property rights is or a clear delineation of property, including administrative system for managing property rights, often can be is a prerequisite for implementing any of these value capture schemes. And also, in this case, in India's case, could be a barrier for doing that. But then I guess coming from China, just maybe I'm a little bit overly optimistic, because we have that issue in China as well. So for the longest time, it's a long-term investment to build institutions like property registration system, cadastre, and also use the latest technology like drones to do mapping and to combine the geographic data with the property or data, or even and create an overlay. So I think there's definitely this challenge is huge. It cannot be addressed overnight. But citing China's experience is that you can always start with something small, like try to do it, run a pilot project in maybe one locality or one state or city that has better governance, has better data or record, and see if you can do something there, and then generate some lessons and see what, and then identify what is the most urgent need in the land reform, whether it's a streamlined process for adjudicating land-related dispute, or it's more like just try to figure out who owns what and then collect that data, or maintain the data, or figure out the ownership. I think there are a lot of things that can be done just at a smaller scale and using like an experimental approach. And if we can generate some lessons learned from those practices, that could be helpful for thinking about broader issues like more systemic land reforms, or how to scale it up and expand those institutions in other regions. And then another question I saw, which by Dr. Jacqueline, he asked, well, the question is, data on land is very scarce in India. How can we bridge the gap? What could be the proxy variables? So this is very interesting. And then I mentioned that but myself, I'm no expert in data collection, or especially the land data in India. But we did engage with a group of researchers, and I'm just looking at their deliverables. Basically, they provide a data summary of all data sets they collected on urban data in Indian cities. So I see that they include, just reading the table of contents here, so they've collected data on litigations, like land-related litigations, including e-courts, and data from e-courts and the real estate regulatory authorities. They collected data on regulations, including floor area ratios, inner city and intra-city, as well as transferable development rights data in Hyderabad and Mumbai. They also have recorded data on rent control practices, and as well as taxation and land revenue, including the state revenue from stamp duties and other land taxes, property tax revenue, and also data on urban average rent or wage and current rents from web scrapings, like I think equivalent to Zillow's or these real estate search property listing service. And they also have data on home amenity ownership, building conditions, use, materials, and yeah, so that's what they have, and also some block level household and firm data. So there are many metrics. So I think what they did is interesting to us because they linked different data sets together, but I'm happy to learn more from you, and you know, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll try to see if I can share this with this group.
Okay, thank you. Well, we've gone half an hour over our intended time, but it was very interesting. So thank you very much. And I'll hand over to Charan to conclude the current session.
I was very worried because I know they're starting their day in the US, and the number of questions that kept pouring in, Rui, you yourself realized that you did an excellent presentation, and it got so much of interest, and the variety of questions that came through were brilliant. We are also thankful to you, Zindrui, for spending extra time with us. And today I realized that getting you over was such a great experience. We learned about China and rest of the world, including America and Europe and England. That was very, very useful. So I must thank you. I must thank the participants. I must thank the chairman for chairing the session and bringing out the best that we could get in this discussion. Highly policy-oriented research, highly policy-oriented discussion, and this is exactly what EGROW stands for. Tomorrow, we'll be placing the recording on our website, and everybody is welcome to use it, and I'm sure it's going to be used extensively. I have a very interesting announcement to make. Next Friday, same time, 5:30 to 6:30, we have Professor Lucrezia Richlin from London School of Economics. She is writing a book on the European Central Bank, and she's covering various things in that. We requested her to come and discuss with us the crisis and the ECB, and she has agreed to it. So next week, 5:30 to 6:30, Professor Lucrezia Richlin from London School, we would like to invite all of you to come and participate in this discussion. So once again, thanks everybody. Thank you, Sindri, once again. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.